All right, thank you guys so much for your participation and your excitement and your tweeting during the breakout sessions. They all sounded like they went really well. And now we are here for our closing keynote, and I am very excited to introduce our next speaker, and I know many of you are very excited to hear her as well. VCU's own Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom. Dr. Cottom is an assistant professor here in the Department of Sociology, as well as a faculty associate with Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And again, I will not read you her entire bio. You guys can read that, and I believe some of you are familiar with her work as well. So without any further ado, here's Dr. McMillan Cottom.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Hi, everybody. Okay, so the setup of this is very strange. I feel like Steve Jobs doing this long stretch up here, so I don't have anything remotely that exciting to talk to you about. Okay, so first of all, thanks for having me. And I have been following online. It's the first week of class for us, so I'm doing that thing where I'm trying to remember what my job is. So unfortunately, I couldn't be here physically all day, but I have enjoyed following you online. So for those who have been participating, know that it made a difference for me. I was able to be in two places at one time. Let's see. How about we start with an outline of what I hope I will speak with you about today, but to also let you know that in the spirit of openness, right, I tend to be fairly comfortable with being responsive to questions and feedback and comment that can take us in different directions. I'm fine with that. So that's the first thing you should probably know about me. The second thing you should probably know is that I'm also fine with call and response. If you want to speak back, that's fine. Just know that I'll speak back to you, too. So, risk and reward is actually a theme for my talk, so that's a good way for us to keep it in mind. You probably should also know that I'm a sociologist and kind of what that means about my approach to thinking about openness and thinking about all versions of open, which I'll talk about here in a moment. It's not just open data, not just open platforms, open pedagogy, but hopefully a theory of openness that sort of brings all of those elements together is what I'll be talking about. So as a sociologist, the way that I tend to approach the study of things, or even just sort of like my general interest in things, is I tend to be interested in who has what and why, right? That's what I'll mean when I talk about what it means to try to be open in an age of inequality. Now, every age has inequality. So part of what happened here is you need a title for these things way ahead of time, way before you're actually thinking about what you might say, right? So I thought, well, no matter what happens, this works, right? I knew nothing was going to happen between last month and right now where that wouldn't be true. But the second reason, hopefully, is a little bit more directly applicable, which is truly there seems to be something about this moment of our iteration of inequality that has particular salience for those of us working in the modern university. That's what I mean, right? What does it mean to try to do open out in the wild is one thing, right? What it means to do it in an organizational context, in an institution, can look like something else altogether. So that's my perspective. What does that look like in that context? The other thing that is informing what I'll be talking about today is some work that I've been doing with my colleagues in the VCU Department of Sociology. I'm going to use a lot of I today as my main pronoun. It's almost never true. I'm going to do it because I know that's how I think and it's going to fall out of my mouth. You should know that just about everything I say about our program today is actually a group effort. So I'd like to identify some of those folks. My colleagues, Dr. Tara Stam, the department chair, Dr. Jennifer Johnson, Dr. Meredith Katz, Michael Pastor, Tom Woodward, all work with me in the digital sociology program. So I'm now in my third year at VCU, and one of the things that I was asked to do when I came here was to reimagine our online degree program, right? We were at a place that actually might feel familiar to many of you in this room, which was the idea of online education had matured to the point where finally traditional universities were taking it more seriously, right, as an endeavor. The online degree program at VCU had existed, I think, for about 15 years or so, but the idea of us doing it more deliberately was fairly new. So with my colleagues, who I just identified, we set out to reimagine what the online digital sociology degree would be. And the first thing we did was we said, well, first of all, we don't know how to do sociology writ large online without critically interrogating the fact and the reasons why we're online and what we're using when we're online. So that became our focus. The digital sociology focus was sort of the way we grouped our understanding of what that degree program would be. And I'd like to point out for us down here at the bottom what our sort of ethic of doing this work is, right? Because it dovetails with my own. So the really important part here is the critical part, the critically engaged part, right? So there are ways to do sociology where you don't think too critically about what you're doing. Lots of people do that work that way, right? And I won't name them, and it's just fine. And you can have a wonderful career doing that. You know, it in no way hinders your ability to become a top-notch sociologist in our profession, right? Then there's this other way to do sociology, and that is this approach that we are always supposed to be thinking reflexively about the things that we're in, whether those be systems, relationships, or institutions, right? So the critical part is pretty important, and I'll be talking about that quite a bit through this talk. So this is what I wanted to talk to you about in the roadmap, to give an overview of our approach to thinking about digital sociology, because at the heart of it was us wanting to embrace open at all of its levels of possibility for the program, because we thought open was inherently critical, right? That it had a sort of democratic ethos to it that goes at the heart of what an institution traditionally is, which is closed. Right? Institutions, by design, are about putting boundaries around something and controlling access to it. So to be open was to be critical in our understanding of the word. Right? Then I want to talk to you about what I think works so far. And then I'm going to talk to you about what kind of works. And then I'll talk to you about what is not working, right? So it's sort of some takeaways about what is possible in the context of unequal resources, working within a closed institution, trying to do an open degree program. Okay? Unless y'all decide you want to talk about something else, which is also fine. All right, so you should probably know what digital sociology is, because again, it gets at sort of our theory of openness. So there's lots of stuff up here. Our students are overwhelmingly working adults, which again, very common right now in the, in the typical university, perhaps not in the traditional elite universities, but it's very common overall in higher education. Because of that, they actually need to develop skill sets, right? They're thinking about higher education in the context of it doing something for them, both professionally and personally. So we wanted to be really intentional about trying to get over this divide between whether or not higher education should be all theory or whether it should do some form of job training, right? So part of openness to us was understanding that the students who would be coming to us, quite frankly, didn't have much use for that sort of theoretical divide. Frankly, they need both, right? They need both. And so that informs how we end up setting up the curriculum and what some of our challenges ended up being. Our students are trying to learn how to be sociological about their critique of digital life. So this is common, this was us borrowing from the media literacy field, right? The idea of producing critical consumers of media, right? But was also responding to research that said we kind of moved beyond the concept of us all just being consumers of media, that one of the aspects of the digital society and what it had produced was that we were now all consumers and producers of media all at the same time. And sociologically, we were thinking about that same sort of framing, right? That we are not just sort of passively consuming what the digital society now means for us, getting your news online, applying for jobs online, right? Using online for your financial transactions, using online for information, online being used against you in surveillance, criminal justice systems, et cetera, right? But that we were also producing all of that data, right? That's all that trace data that we're all producing all the time when we try to interact in the world now, that we don't have a whole lot of control over. So with our students, we wanted to be very aware of the fact that they needed to understand how to consume data critically, but also to be critical about the fact that we're always producing data and what that means for different groups of people. We do a lot of data analysis, which kind of connects to our commitment to teaching sort of applied skills in the program. And then again, the theory of the program was that it would be critical and reflexive. Now, we were doing this in a particular context, not doing it alone. So when we decided to reimagine what the online degree program could be here at VCU, one of the several things were happening. We had OER Commons had become, normalized, right? Which provided us with a repository of possible resources for teaching, and that was important, which we'll talk about a bit more here in a moment, right? Soc Archive was happening, right? This was a archive, a digital repository designed specifically for social science research. And I should point out that I'm on that board with my colleagues who are doing that, so it is sociologically focused. It's modeled on the National Bureau of Education Research model, so the NBR model, right? And so it's this idea of doing preprint publications of sociological research so that people can access it without going through the dreaded journal paywall. That's literally the entire point. The secondary point is that you get feedback that makes your argument better, but that's really the point, all right? So this was the context within which we were doing this. So we felt like we had a lot of support, right? The idea of using these materials was starting to become a little bit more normal, although I would not go so far as to say it's typical, right? We are atypical. I think we're exceptional in how much we have embraced doing these things. But it was at least the kind of thing that we didn't have to justify it quite so much anymore, right? We had a wealth of resources here at the VCU library, a wonderful resource librarian who is a trained sociologist and is deeply engaged in producing open materials. And so we thought, all right, we're ready to tackle the idea of this. And so the question that was sort of driving us was, could we practice what we preach? Did we have enough of the right resources? Were enough of the institutional sort of things in place to allow us to do an accessible program that was critical but also rigorous? I still don't have an answer to that, but that's the guiding question. We're working on an answer. I'll tell you how we're working on it. So one of the first things we had to do is we had to reimagine. We couldn't do open in course silos, right? So this is often what happens. So at VCU, we had adopted some time ago the idea of e-portfolios as a learning assessment tool, right? And all of us were incentivized to use e-portfolios. Now, we were incentivized to use them, but let's be clear, almost no one has figured out how to do that, right? So some institutions do a better job of it. I've got friends at CUNY who I think do a bang-up job of it, by the way. If you've never visited their website, you can sort of troll through some of their students' e-portfolios. We've got some mixed research out there, but truly, nobody knows how to do it, right? So we had tons of institutional initiative to do it. We were willing to do it, right? The theory of e-portfolios worked with what we were trying to do. What was a little bit more difficult was how do you do that in practice? So the first few years of the program, what that looked like was adopting the university's blogging platform, right? RAM pages. So every incoming student at VCU gets service space for what they call their RAM page. They get a blogging space that is imagined for them to use as an e-portfolio tool as they go through the curriculum at VCU. So that's the resource that we had and that we were trying to leverage. And then we had sort of the institutional imperative to think about and employ e-portfolios. And in the first few years of trying to do it, this may sound very common to many of you in the room, this is what happens. The professors who are interested in it use it. The professors who are not, do not. And the students get the message that it's not all that important. Right? They use it when they've got to use it for the classes for the professors who require it, and then forget about it during all the other times, right? But the whole point of an e-portfolio is that it is supposed to be this meta-analysis of the student's reflection on their learning. It's metacognition, right? It is demonstrating synthesis across their different courses, right? And showing some development across time. Now, we're in a modern university, so the real impetus for doing this is theoretically, the students are supposed to have this e-portfolio that they then take out into the job market to show people what they can do, right? Those of us a little bit more interested in the theory of learning, however, tend to think of them as we've known that metacognition is important for a long time, and this is a tool for us to do metacognition in the classroom. Right? But because both those things were happening, we had the reason to adopt it. And so that's exactly what happened in the sociology program, right? Our students were getting intensive sort of e-portfolio experience in some courses and then none in other courses, right? And then at the end of the degree program, when we tell them to put all of these elements together, they've got sort of an uneven collection of materials, right? which undermines the entire point of an e-portfolio. So the challenge for the digital sociology program was initially about how the heck do we make an e-portfolio work as an assessment tool? Well, one of our first problems was that the way that courses were set up, that sort of spikiness, could not work in that model, right? So the digital sociology faculty got together and said, well, then we will abandon that model. And so drawing on research and higher education assessment, we decided to go with a cohort model for the digital sociology program. And that took actually several really critical institutional changes. It meant changing our enrollment schedule, right? So what had happened is just like any other public university, our students were able to enroll or to be admitted to the program in both fall and spring, right? What that meant is that you had students at vastly different, in the same sort of year cohort, but at different points of development in the program, right? So the first thing we did is we switched to a fall-only enrollment. All of the students coming in one year come in at the same time, right? The second thing required was for us to come up with a restricted sort of course, pathway course model, right? That meant the students come in a cohort and they take the same courses in the same sequence, right? Because the courses are sequenced, we then had the sort of faculty role of being able to say, well, I know by the time they get to my digital sociology capstone course that they've done methods, they've done public sociology, and I know what kind of content they've done in those courses because we have collaborated on them, right? So I could build my assignments on other people's assignments. Right? So in practice, that looks like Dr. Stam and I getting together, and Dr. Stam often teaches the theory class and one of the methods classes, and knowing that they have done a research project that uses Twitter data to look at geocoding of tweets around a social conflict. Right? I know they've done that. So by the time they get to my course at the end, the capstone course in digital sociology, right, I can ask them to revisit that project, right? And now we will do applying critical social theory to the analysis that you got from that data, right? In this way, the e-portfolios end up structuring how the program works. The other context for doing this was that we didn't have a model based on sociology, right? So we're making this up as we go along. This is us over here on the far end, and that little 10% over there. One of the only departments that's offering an entire degree online, trying to use open platforms specifically, and the only one doing it at the graduate level. So here's what worked. My number one takeaway from reflecting on how this process works, and we've pointed this out in an article my colleagues and I just published about lessons about online teaching and openness in our digital sociology program, was that the only way this could work is if we had leadership that was willing to embrace it, right? That without a department chair, in our case, Jennifer Johnson, who knew deeply the institutional context of VCU and what kind of resources we were required to pull this off, none of this would have happened. Right? We had an extreme amount of trust among the faculty who were teaching in the digital sociology program. So the only reason why our cohort model works is because I trust what assignments my other colleagues have done, right? And that we share and collaborate with those materials. And because we are willing to compromise and be extremely responsive to student changes. So the first thing we learned, the first year, everything actually went surprisingly well. And then the second year of the cohort model, what we realized is that the second cohort was different from the first cohort. They had different people in them who needed different things. And so it meant that we had to sort of restructure, if not the content of what we were teaching, sort of our approaches to teaching for each cohort. And that requires a lot of communication across courses with faculty members. What only kinda worked, and this is where we get to the tensions with open educational resources, right? So the first thing we found is that in social science, data is super important, and there are lots of open data repositories that social scientists use. I mean, the typical ones from like the US Census data, right? But we also use the General Social Science Survey, et cetera. So we're comfortable with using quote unquote open data, right? And learning how to navigate those. And those are pretty typical in sociology. So in that respect, I think we had a head start on understanding what openness meant. It means producing data in your own projects that other people can then use. It means being deliberative about about you keeping track of your code book for your data so other people can come behind you and use it. So when our students are producing their own data, we use sort of the open data model so that they can contribute to the open data environment that drives a lot of social science. Here's what didn't work so well. Open educational resources. So we had in mind, whether that's through ignorance or ignorance, those are our two choices, we had in mind when we were developing the program that we would use all OER materials for all of the courses. That was our goal, 100% OER materials. Now, what was driving our desire to do that, first of all, was understanding who our students were, right? OER materials being more accessible meant they'd be more affordable, and for the typical VCU student, that matters. And then, of course, though, it was just that we thought, let's live what we, let's walk the talk, right? Did I get that right? Yeah, let's walk the talk, right? So let's use open educational resources. Here were some of the problems that we had trying to do that. Quality and rigor varied tremendously. Right? There was almost nothing available in what I would call critical sociology, right? And even less available in critical sociology that was appropriate for an advanced undergraduate or graduate student. Right? So we started out the first semester when we got together to sort of do our collaborative syllabus building, trying to find open educational resources, and what we left with was a list of books, right? So we went back to where we started, and we continue to revisit that every year when we have sort of our planning meetings for the program, and trying to figure out how we're going to navigate that. As a critical sociologist in a critical sociology program, however, our real concern, one of the things that we noticed was that what we were really lagging in significantly, even more so than like quality and rigor, were the open educational resource materials that deal in things that we really care about, particularly race, class, and gender, and/or/slash inequality, right? What we did not have were open educational resource materials that look at African American experiences, right? The experiences of women, gender, wage gap, almost nothing about sexualities, right? Almost nothing about sort of queer theory, some of the major sociological theories that have emerged over the last 30 years that are really driving the discipline. There were almost no materials about things like intersectionality, et cetera. Again, really important things, critically important to critical sociology, right? There was almost nothing. So we couldn't use open educational resources in that context. So what chafed? That was my nice way of saying this does not work. And we are still living in this uncomfortable spot of trying to see how we move forward in this thing that works. So in the interest of being honest, let's talk about what does not work so well. The first is working in a really big, complex institution. That's accretion up at the top. So this is this idea that as institutions get bigger, we just tend to keep adding more offices and officers and roles and never get rid of any, right? And so what you have are 5 different offices who are in charge of online, right? Right? Staffed differently with different objectives, right? And no way for you to figure out who does what. And often, they don't know who does what, right? We had big meetings with trying to get everybody around the table who does anything with online educational delivery in the university. We got them around the table, and they didn't know how their functions differed or who we should go to with which questions, right? So what we had in mind was that we were going to do this flow chart of, if you need X, right, go see Y. Right? And we were never able to produce it, okay? So the second thing was something that is impacting all of us, right? It's the market logic of the university. And it's the market logic of why we're supposed to adopt openness as a model, right? That it'll be cheaper, right? Which, by the way, I'm about to say it is not in a moment, just to spoil the whole thing. And it is not cheaper. It's just about who's cheap you value. But okay, we'll go there in a second. But it was the idea, anyway, of selling us on openness is that it will be less expensive, right? That it will drive down costs, especially resource holding costs, right? So server space, et cetera, sort of the physical space of having materials because then they'll live on the web, et cetera, which is basically us just outsourcing the cost of those things. Again, it doesn't make them cheaper to produce. But the logic of why we were supposed to do it also made it really difficult for us to do our job, because we went in understanding and taking on the assumptions of the fact that these things would be less expensive, right? And then what we found out in reality is that they were super expensive to implement. The first expense being our time, right? This is an extremely time-intensive process, trying to use open educational materials, open data, and having sort of an open platform of learning, right? It took having faculty hours, and all had to be tenure-track faculty because we could not ask this of contingent faculty, right? Because that's another area where inequality is introduced, and so we take that very seriously. So we don't ask our contingent faculty to do that type of off-the-deck labor, right? So that meant us doing it, and as it turns out, we're expensive, right? So getting us in a room for 2 days at a time to try to figure out how to use open materials, where to find them, where to vet the quality of them, how to implement them across different classes for different groups of students with diverse learning needs, turned out to be extremely expensive. Okay? And then again, working without a model. On almost none of this have we had a model of delivery, right? Of sort of quality control, of assessment. So at every step of the process, we have had to develop everything that we use from scratch, right? How are we going to quote unquote grade e-portfolios, right? How are we going to make them meaningful in the context of making degree progress, right? How are we going to have students do some of their learning open and online, yet protect the integrity of the learning environment, which is a really difficult one in sociology in ways that I don't think is true of all disciplines, right? I can't teach my majority women students about race, class, and gender in an open online platform in the context of our current society, right? I cannot expose them to those things, right? What does it mean to adopt platforms that may be open but are for profit, right? What does it mean then when I use a model like Twitter, which is open access, right, but does not open up the framework of Twitter for us to experiment with it and use it in ways that might be conducive for the learning environment for our students? Those are questions that we had to deal with every step of the way, and many that do not have a really good answer, and every time it took another iteration of our syllabus, our curriculum, and how we would deliver learning. Now I want to take you through the part that I really wanted to talk a little bit more about with you today. This whole thing about critical sociology OER resources in race, class, and gender. So I've just got a little journey of what that looked like when we were trying to do it. So we're kind of newbies in the way that I think most people are who come to OER. Most of you in the room are not. So you could think about us at the time when we were trying to do this as the people that you're usually helping, right? So this is not you, but this is the people who you are trying to help. So this was us with the idea of doing openness, being 100% on board with it. We bought in totally, right? Having probably more faculty resources involved than the typical department would, right? And wanting to adopt this thing. So the first thing we did is we went to a search engine and we put in open educational resources in sociology, right? And you got a list of sort of repositories, which by the way, most of them using sponsored ads. So if we were like everybody else and clicked the first couple, we did not come to the OER Commons first, right? This is why I start with the ones that came up first, right? And so it was things like this one. And so we start looking at the materials that are available for sociology. And you'll see things over there. You've got a plethora of introduction to sociology textbooks, right? You've got stuff like sociology of the family, so some of our sort of big questions, right? And what we would broadly call things like social problems in sociology. What you do not see, perhaps, are some of the things that we were most interested in teaching, right? Class inequality, race, racism, gender inequality, and almost nothing on sexualities, right? So if we were going to use open educational resources, we couldn't teach anything from sociology from the last 40 years, right? That was the problem that we had. Going to another, when we did find our way to the OER Commons, it is at least the best set up repository for information, but I'll show you what the search results you get when you do graduate text for sociology. You get a grand total of 13, right? And sort of the same patterns. Nothing dealing with theory, data, analysis, sort of the core driving learning objectives in a graduate sociology program. And then I would be remiss if I didn't point out, we went to libraries, right? So we said, well, maybe we're not going to find those materials and things like race, class, and gender in the sociology text. Maybe we'll find them in the area subfield, the subdiscipline. So that means, so if I'm looking for things on race, going to the African American Studies Index, right? If I was looking for gender, going to the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Index, et cetera, right? So that's the next thing we started doing. So this is an example from African American Studies, right? That had almost nothing in it, right? Almost nothing in it. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then I would be remiss, based on my work in predatory for-profit higher education, if I did not point out that the search engines that you use to find some of these materials, this is like the third, I think, search result that we had was for academicearth.org. You're still in a for-profit platform that uses Google Buy Ads, and look at what's down at the bottom, right? Normalizing the idea of something like Cabell, which is a for-profit college, alongside the databases that I send my students to use materials, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the dearth of materials available in things like race, class, and gender and inequalities, and what I would call the pressing sort of emergent social problems, and why we couldn't do this in an open way. The first problem is who can make open educational resources. Remember I told you, you go to the African American database, and there's almost nothing in it, right? And you see similar patterns, less so in gender studies, but still similar patterns across these sort of other critical subdisciplines. And well, the thing is about open, it's sort of like how we started the development of the digital sociology program, which is if you buy the reasons why you're supposed to do open, right, you have very little reason to sort of think or interrogate at that moment this part of the stuff. But as you try to actually put it in practice, this part of open is what becomes the most critical part of trying to be open. The problem is anybody can do open educational resources, which is why we see sort of varying degrees of quality, but not really, right? The people who can do open have institutional support, they have time, they have the cumulative advantage of tenure and digital skills without the immediate need for pay, job security, mobility, or prestige, right? Of the 18 resources that were in that African American database, 18, grand total of 18, I think 9 were from somebody at an Ivy League institution. Now, I personally do not have a problem with the Harvard, Yale, Princetons of the world, right? But I do not want them producing the core open knowledge available for the entire discipline of sociology, right? In fact, the critical subdisciplines of sociology are usually being critical about them, right? Right. So the groups of researchers who are more likely to produce a sort of reflexive research about things like race, class, and gender tend not to be those who are at prestigious universities, right? And that's who we need the open educational resources from the most, right? Those are the people who are more likely to produce that kind of knowledge, and that's who we want to expose our students to. That's who we want to center in the discipline of sociology, especially in a critical sociology program. And because of this, that's who is almost entirely missing from the production of open educational resources, which is why we had to go back to books. So the way I now think about what we're doing, right, is I think about how we can make our resources do double and triple duty in the modern context of a corporate marketized higher education system, right? And this is both drawing on our experiences of building the digital sociology program, but it's also very much about how I come to higher education and how I understand it, right? So I'm a product of historically black colleges and universities. I went to North Carolina Central University in undergrad in Durham, North Carolina. It's the good school in Durham. And I come from, I said it. And I come from a background of people who were produced by and worked in things like freedom schools during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Panther Party in the 1970s and 80s. So my thinking about what we kind of have the opportunity to do if we were going to reimagine openness, right, was how could we take the resources of open, right, modify them and make them do double or triple duty in these ways that fill in some of the missing gaps that I pointed out to you, right, of data and materials that are not always available for these types of questions. And this is how some of the ways that I think about us doing it now, and some of the questions we ask ourselves now when we have those meetings at the beginning of the year where we collaborate and think about the program. So the first was, instead of being just so concerned about the sort of theory of openness, which we thought, well, we can now maybe take that for granted, what we wanted to focus on was how we could use every decision point in the program to solve a practical problem, right? To solve a practical problem. An example of what that looks like, since we have a shortage of materials available on critical knowledges in sociology, how could we build an alternative resource for ourselves by sort of opening up what we considered open, right? So that looks like for us things like this now. We now include the transcripts of speeches, right, from people in the discipline who may not ever produce a textbook on race, class, and gender, but who do public lectures, right? So one way to sort of leverage our resources, some of the resources we have in the department, is to use transcription services of those speeches to basically produce texts, right, that were missing from the OER world. Every time we sort of make that decision, what we're also thinking about is, what are we about to do with this limited resource we have, whether it be money or faculty time or administrative time, to build some capacity that is going to increase our ability to do this work into the future, right? So we don't want to solve a problem in the short term that doesn't open it up for us to do more work in the long term. So that means things like when we collaborate on our syllabi, how do we put them in an archive that allows us to use them together to make them searchable? How do we produce assignments that work across different classes so that we're reusing some of the same data and work that have already been done by faculty members, so we're not reinventing the wheel every time? When we identify a resource, how do we make it available to everybody in the program and in the department? Right? And part of running, again, the Information Underground Railroad is about building institutional capacity for critical information and forms of knowledge, right, that will outlive us, right? How would we do that? And so thinking about solving local problems here at the university, but building capacities that will move beyond the university. So how do I open up and why do we make our syllabi available publicly, right? Which we do, despite it sometimes being challenging to do so. How do we make our course materials and our assignments operate in the same way? We publish our curriculum and we open it up to sort of colleagues' review and that kind of thing. And acting very deliberately and conscientiously about how we use materials, because we want to model for our students in this program that this thing is not the process of what you'll use, which data you'll use, which books you use, is not something that just falls from the sky, that you have to be deliberate about what you choose to use to answer certain types of questions, because we think that's part of a critical digital practice. So at the end, I told you I didn't really have an answer. This is where we are in the middle. We're in the fourth year of the digital sociology curriculum as it stands now. And we're thinking about whether or not open education resources can even participate in our ability to build the sort of institutional capacity that runs sort of beneath the institution, that opens up these spaces for problem solving and thinking critically for our students. And we're not sure. And we're not sure for a few reasons. We're not sure because we haven't been able to pinpoint who is producing the materials and how we can impact who produces those materials, right? So I would feel more comfortable with saying yes to this question if I thought that there was some way for me as a faculty member to influence who gets to produce open educational resources, right? So some things are open but not democratic, right? And we have decided that both of those things kind of matter, right? We want to be able to talk back to the archives and the resources that we use, and we want them to be as iterative with us as we are in how we implement them in the program and in the classroom. And so until I think we can kind of do that, which means all kinds of other changes in the institutional context, which are familiar to everybody in the room, which is make it possible for people to get tenure with them, right? Give people the money and the time to do it, value it, give us resources in the library, pay people, et cetera. Okay, so until all of those kinds of things are in place, what we say now is that we probably are more interested in sort of a democratic educational resource program. what we are working on right now, we are working on how do we have online classes in an open way that, again, protects the integrity of the learning process for our students. That matters a lot when your students tend to be from marginalized communities and have marginalized identities that make them vulnerable to critique and attack online. And so we're still thinking through what that means in the classroom, and I'm always happy to talk more about that and what we're doing. We are trying to figure out how we can take what we are learning both in the classroom and in the research that we bring into the critical digital sociology program to impact sort of the interventions and how the curriculum of sociology is going to mature in the coming years. And we're really, really desperately trying to build a community of people around these things because, again, the first thing we found out is that you just can't do this with a couple of people. Right, again, it's extremely labor intensive, and probably the greatest form of labor that we contribute to it is the time that we create to think together through these really complex questions and problems. And then how are we ethical about how we do the public part of our program? And that's where you can find out more about what we're doing, and then I'll stop there, and I think I'm happy to take questions. Is that what, yeah? Happy to do Q&A? Then yes, that's what until somebody tells me no. So I'll stop there. Hi in the back, how are you?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk and a wonderful initiative to hear about. I'm wondering, I'm sure you've addressed or considered some of this. I'm wondering if you can talk about the considerations behind having student work or some of those e-portfolios or some of the other outputs that the students are getting from the program feedback in as OER for the next round or the next generation of participants?
Yeah, that's actually something, that is a great question, thank you. So we have two, I think, considerations. So the first one is we try to reuse as much of our student work as possible, which is easier with our data work than it is with our theory work, right? I mean, they're graduate students, almost no graduate students' theory work is good theory work. It's fine. We're working through things, okay? They're not going to reimagine social theory, and that's okay. But with data, it is easier, right? So they are doing things that are not quite yet, typical in sociology, right? So they're doing data scraping, and they are working with APIs. One of the first things all of our students learn how to do is to work with the API, and they are learning those types of tools. And so those types of things that are important to replicating things and teaching students skills, the students who come after them, teaching those skills. So to make that possible, it's actually kind of, we had to be really deliberate about it. It requires a lot of checking in with each other as faculty to figure out what each other are doing. As all of us know, you can design your syllabus at the beginning of the semester, and halfway through you're realizing, you got to change the whole doggone thing, right? And so how do we keep sort of faculty, the importance of, the academic freedom to do that while kind of keeping a tab on what each other are doing? So it takes a lot of that. So it means when I sit down with the syllabus or the assignments for my course the following semester, it means revisiting what my colleagues have done in the past to see what kind of student work the students have produced. And so, that's not really fancy. That means at our faculty meeting for the program, we say things like, did anybody do a really good project this semester? Right, like who really did something, and I can say her name because she just graduated, and I think that means we now own her likeness and name. One of our students, Rua Gupta, did a wonderful project using Twitter data and geocaching, right? And we were like, oh yeah, Rusha's project is great, put that in the thing, right? It first of all shows students what's possible, but it also gives them something to work from. What we didn't want is each cohort rediscovering the same wheel, right? So these things ideally would be progressive and cumulative forms of knowledge. Now, having said that, the one thing we haven't worked out and that we're always really conscious of and talking a lot about is, how do we do that for the purposes of learning, but not like generating profit for anybody, right? So like ideally, we would put Rusha's data set up and people would run with it, right? Out in the world, and they would run with it. Okay, where could we put it where it was not generating money for somebody's ad stream? As it turned out, that was harder than you might think. Our existing data repositories where people now put data in sociology don't really know what to do with Twitter data, like as a form, the format of it. So like that wasn't a good fit. We just didn't want to slap it up on somebody's WordPress site or something, right? So we don't have the money to build our own repository or the resources to do it. So right now it just sort of ends up living on a local drive in the university for our students to use. So that's what I meant about public actually becomes really complicated because you also don't want to we don't want to expose our students to like undue sort of market relationships that they didn't really sign up for when we try to make their stuff public. So that's those are two decision points. But yeah, we think about it a lot. Mm-hmm.
So I'm Dave Gamandi at University of Virginia. Thank you for the political economic analysis of openness. It's missing.
Awesome.
So
Thanks for that.
can you talk a little bit more about how we unwittingly may be reinforcing the dominant ideologies and dominant systems, economic systems, through openness without realizing it? Also, the need for critical language about openness, for open access journals, the pay-to-pay publish, I call that a neoliberalized form of open access.
Right.
So we don't have this critical language in which to examine this movement yet either.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how we may unwittingly may be exacerbating inequality and dominant ideologies in openness and the fallacy of markets solutions for the market's problems?
Yeah, yeah. So, yes, first, thanks for acknowledging. That's exactly what we hope that we're doing. What we hope the theory of the program is saying to our students, and we say this quite explicitly to them, we got to be in this thing, right? This is the great challenge of any capitalist enterprise. We got to be in it. So we don't have much choice about that. But we can't be critical about it, right? So what I can say to you is, oh, we chose to use this, but let me tell you about this thing that we're going to use, right? And sort of having that sort of theory of practice in the program sort of makes that possible. Now, that's possible in ways in sociology that may not be true for other disciplines. We can get away with that because that's what sociologists are supposed to be doing to a certain extent. But that, that's a privilege of our ability to be able to do that. So we are very transparent with our students and with ourselves when we make these decisions. Like, we know some things we just have to adopt because they're cheaper, right? Or we know there's some things that we have to adopt because of the institutional norms, right? Which, brings me a point that I want to circle back to. If I forget, will you tell me? Thank you. And about how some of the challenges we have doing that. So we are absolutely reproducing. I think we're doing this in a couple of ways. So the first is the way that open gets sold to your university at the administration level, right, is all about, again, all of that market stuff, right? And then our incentive usually for doing it is market-based, because basically what they have said to us as a department is, if you embrace this ideology, we'll give you some resources. Well, in a resource-starved environment, that's a really strong incentive. So part of, again, trying to build the sort of information capacity beneath that is, okay, yeah, but how do we take that and then make that critical or liberatory, right? And what we've come up with is being very transparent with the students and with ourselves about everything that we adopt and trying to make that part of the learning process. By keeping track of and reflecting on all of those decisions that we make and then to publish them like we just did recently, right? Our article about like developing this program is very much a critique about the political economy that influenced our decisions to even do it, right? And so trying to make that transparent and publish it and do that work. Some of the things that, that I don't think we have to expound a lot on it for this audience, right, that we can't change are how could we do this ethically given what we know about tenure and non-tenure track faculty in the university, right? So the incentive for the program is, again, from the administration's point of view, is to do this potentially profitable thing. And the way to usually do that is to use contingent faculty for all of these things. So one of our first decisions is that we wouldn't do that. It would be tenure track faculty. The only reason we were able to get away with that, however, is because we had sort of a leadership at the time that was able to make that happen. But like making those decisions about who will be doing that work and being really conscious about it, is, we hope, part of our response to understanding that, the incentives to do this work don't always have a whole lot to do with the reasons that we're told that we're doing it. Which brings me back to a point. I talked a moment about one of our challenges being building capacity in institutions, I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that we found super surprising about trying to pull this off. Pull this off meaning build a program using as much openness as possible that was also critically interrogating systems, et cetera, offering them for mostly non-traditional students online in a resource-starved environment. So you would think doing that kind of thing, so like I've got a syllabus up online for one of my online courses at Rampages that is quite literally, I think the first paragraph of it says, you know, the entire point of this class is to figure out how technology is racist, classist, and sexist, right? Like that's literally, and I can get away with it because I'm a sociologist and so it's fine, and nobody reads my syllabus, so that's also fine, right? But, so, you know, that's what we're doing. You would think you might have some problems with maybe like a, you know, somebody in a dean's office with that kind of thing, right? Has not been our problem in developing our program. Some of our most challenging pushback to what we have been trying to do in this environment, can anybody want to make a guess about what office in the university we've maybe had the most problems with? Because it was stunning for me. It may not be to y'all, but it was stunning for me. Yes, well now you ruined it. Yes, our problem was with marketing. Right, we were like, first of all, we were like, who is marketing? We didn't even know what that was. And second of all, we were like, why are they talking to us? And then third was like, why do they have so much authority over what we are doing? Right, they had authority because it was online. And online has been thought of a way to generate revenue, not as a learning model. And because of that, in many universities, it falls under the authority of branding and marketing, right? Who said things to us like, you're using the wrong shade of blue. I'm not kidding, right? So we had spent months building out what we were calling these course structures. We were using the WordPress system at the university to build these things that you could then drop your syllabus into, but some of the structure would already be set up for you. And they told us we were using the wrong shade of blue, so we couldn't use it. Right? Part of some of the digital literacy we want to work with our students on is extracting, working with open data sets and extracting that data and then collaborating with each other in real time. So we will use anything to do that, right? We'll use video conferencing apps and software. We will do a mobile app. We've done all kinds of things. Branding and marketing said, you can only use Zoom. I said, why? Because we paid for it. It doesn't work for our purposes. It's not the best interface. It's not teaching our students a skill they're probably going to use in the workforce, right? I tend to like to use the platforms that they'll use at work because that's part of building, again, sort of the cultural capital of our graduates, right? I wanted them to use Slack, for example, which has become quite common, especially in some of their workplaces. Many of them work in like marketing and professional services adjacent capacities. So I wanted to use what they were using at work, right? Can't use Slack. Why? Because we paid for Google Drive for you to use. That's why, right? Could not use productivity software for myself to teach the class, right? Because I don't have administrative rights to my browser. And when I asked for them, they said, you cannot be trusted with it. No. I am not kidding. We had more problems with the content of what we were teaching from branding and marketing than any other part of the university, which I think speaks very neatly to the political economy of trying to learn in the modern context. That your problem, really, the site of power for us right now is branding and marketing, not the administration. I know, right? As soon as somebody's got time when I'm not doing this, I should write that up. I know. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
Giving the information that is valid to them that you have in a classroom setting in discussion versus an online that could possibly be published.
Right.
And with sociology and psychology especially, that can be difficult.
Can be almost, yeah, what we found, almost immediately. It was our first, practical problem. It was the first week of the class of the first time we tried to do it, when we realized, oh, that's not going to work at all. Because what the online discussion space is who are you? Yeah. what is your, let's reflect on your social location kind of stuff, which usually means talking about your race, class, and gender identities. What are your pronouns? And then I get into sensitive information about their sexuality and how they identify, right? So almost immediately we thought, oh, no, we can't do that. And again, especially considering what we teach. So this is what we now, we met about it and, rework things, and mostly this is how we now manage that. So we went to a closed online discussion classroom environment. There was no other way. So all the classroom discussion still happens now in a closed environment, not available to the public. We do make a sort of assignment-based, not quota, but we know that we all have a commitment in each of our courses to have a certain percentage, however, of our student assignments be made publicly available some kind of way. So that means, for example, I can talk most, of course, about my courses. So that means I just did the digital sociology capstone course last semester. And what we had the students do is we created an online magazine using Medium, right? Where they engaged mostly on the reflection on some of their assignments rather than posting their assignments. So it was very similar to the format that Context magazine used, and Context is a sociology journal of public sociology for the American Sociological Association. So we used that format. So they were still learning sort of the sociological way to talk about it, but we made it public. I then serve as the comment moderator for the magazine. So it's trying to be the authoritative layer between them and comments, right? Which is actually much tougher than it looks and sounds, and ideally we would do something else with that. But yeah. So we try to have like a quota of a certain percentage of their work be available publicly. But yeah, so we have a public-facing classroom and then a private classroom, basically, is how it works out.
We may have time for one more quick question.
Thank you very much for what you were saying about your process regarding e-portfolios. I just wanted to say thank you for that. It's very nice to hear that level and that kind of thinking about how to engage with that technology and that form of assessment and expression. What I wanted to ask you was, you talked a lot about OER and textbooks. Mm-hmm. I was curious why at a graduate level you're not having them engage directly with the scholarly literature and maybe through open access journals.
Yeah, they are. Well, first of all, almost everything that we would need to be teaching. So what you're trying to do in a graduate sociology program is teach them the history of the discipline, right? So, all of that is going to be paywalled, which is fine for our students, and they do, and we do. We use all of the typical stuff, right? Everybody's going to read Durkheim, everybody's going to read Weber, everybody's going to read the article from whatever. Okay, not a problem. What we were trying to say, however, is that we wanted to complement as much, but I will say some of that older stuff, because it is so old, circulates pretty freely. It's actually usually fairly easy for me to find that, upload it somewhere, link, et cetera, right? And what we were thinking of, the way we conceptualized our syllabus at the time we were doing, is that the syllabus could be a public document that somebody could then follow, right? That's why one of the reasons why we wanted to use as much open materials as possible, always knowing that the journal articles, the empirical articles especially, were almost always going to be paywalled. Having said that, we increasingly have more stuff open access in sociology, but almost nothing that we would consider foundational. I mean, I'll just be honest with you, right? You're still gonna, the big names who do the big articles because they've got the big resources to do them are still in our top 4 journals, and those are gonna be paywalled until we die. Because I've been in that meeting with ASA, I'm serious. They are committed. They are gonna be paywalled until we die. So, what we would have was this huge gap. I could teach you the old stuff, and I could teach you some of the newer stuff, but the stuff, in the middle, the big stuff, there was almost no way to do that without doing, all of the traditional paywall versions. Which again, for our students is fine, but I even say to them, what I want you to be able to do is to look at this again in 5 years when you want to revisit some part of it, when you no longer have the library access, and for you to be able to access it, right? Those are the ways we were thinking about it, but aren't able to pull off just because of the state of the discipline with open, It's expensive to publish OA. depending on where you are in the institution, it doesn't count as much for your tenure. The big names who can do it because they can afford to do open access publishing just don't have any incentive to do it, and so most of them don't. And so we've got a really big gap there in our knowledge for open access journal articles. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.